Patrick, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really excited about this conversation because I have not only read your book and also done courses that you've advised on the XPT course. So thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. I think we're going to have an interesting conversation, Lewis.
For sure. We've already spoken about the implications of travel and how your schedule is now getting a bit hectic. Actually, one thing that almost wasn't on my notes that I wanted to ask you about, and I think you did this, and I saw some posts that you put out early on, was the impact of COVID, obviously on breathing being a respiratory virus that's attacking people. What has been the benefit that you've seen through your work? Had you seen an impact was there any literature on how things like oxygen advantage, nasal breathing had improved impact on COVID?
One paper was written in Microbes and Infection in May of 2020. And it was a hypothesis about the importance of nasal breathing to help mitigate the effects of COVID, and breathing through the nose to harness nasal nitric oxide, and just talking about basic physiology. Now, other than that, I haven't came across a whole lot. There have been clinical trials on an inhaler using nitric oxide, so that you inhale nitric oxide into the lungs, because nitric oxide is antiviral. And it's probably a reflection of our times, because your nose does produce its own source of nitric oxide. And if you hum, for example, if you do breath holding, you can increase nitric oxide 15 or 16 fold. Now, nobody has been talking about the importance of nasal breathing, both for people as a possible preventative. And I'm not going to say that nasal breathing is going to prevent COVID, but what I'm saying is it just makes total sense to breathe in and out through the nose. And the other thing is, for people who are infected, they should be nasal breathing, because if they are mouth breathing, they're more likely to transmit a greater amount of water particles into the air. There's 42% greater water loss breathing out through the mouth. I put out a couple of videos. One was, by accident back in March of 2020. I did a podcast for people with COVID. COVID was just in the scene, and wasn't a whole lot known about it. We knew it was affecting the respiratory tract. And I suppose I was able to draw on the previous 20 years of working with people with asthma and COPD and different lung conditions. And I gave different breathing exercises that if people did get infected, how to help themselves. Because the one thing is that when you have COVID, we have seen people with breath hold times as low as 3 and 4 seconds. Wow. And COVID, even though it affects the respiratory tract, it affects the lungs, it affects breathing, it's also affecting the autonomic nervous system. It's putting the autonomic nervous system into absolute dysregulation. And we have individuals that can't get up out of bed. They are so breathless, they're not able to talk. And these were previously fit individuals. These weren't people with chronic health complaints, and predominantly females who are suffering from long COVID, and between 10 to 30% of those who were infected. And associated with that is POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. And basically, if these individuals stand up, even if they just stand up, their heartbeat will elevate up to as high as 180 beats per minute. Oh, so they're not even able to sit up, they're not able to stand up, they're not able to do anything, and medical intervention is not able to help. Now, the other aspect is that it's all being censored. And even this video, the fact that we've mentioned COVID may prevent this video from being up on YouTube for a long time. Now, I've been lucky, the couple of videos that we have put up, because we made no claims. One has reached 1 million views, and the other one was just put up about 2 weeks ago for people with long COVID. There are breathing exercises that are being taught, even in Mount Sinai Hospital and different hospitals in the United States. And the emphasis is on slow breathing to help to stimulate the vagus nerve and to balance the autonomic nervous system. But the problem is that people with long COVID don't have the ability to breathe slow because they are fighting for breath. So what we need to do is start off at the very, very basis. And we bring in gentle breath holding, breathing in and out through the nose and pinching the nose and holding the breath for maybe 3 seconds. And then breathing normal for 10 or 15 seconds and then doing it again. And exposing the people to gentle doses of air hunger in order to to develop a better tolerance of the gas carbon dioxide, but pretty much to help reduce their state of breathlessness. Now, we also do exercises then to improve alveolar ventilation, because, of course, if you have a breathing complaint, you feel suffocated. You feel that you're not getting enough air. And the natural response is to breathe fast and shallow to alleviate the feeling of suffocation. But the problem with fast and shallow breathing is that the proportion of air that you're drawing into your body, not very much of that air is actually getting down into the small air sacs in the lungs for gas exchange to take place. So we teach then no, slow and low breathing. We teach cupping hands to pool carbon dioxide. And then when people make some progress, then we look at interventions then as well as helping to bring a better regulation of the autonomic nervous system. It's a horrendous condition. And I'm in the whole, like people would see me as, kind of outside the field of medicine because I've been working in a breathing technique. But the more I look at these people, this is a serious thing. And I know there's so many different views in terms of vaccinations and non-vaccinations, and people are entitled to it. But I say, you don't want to catch this because I've seen it, and it's not nice.
I think it's definitely showing. I mean, there's a lot of talk around people who have pre-existing conditions and things like that, and even there, you've said people that are healthy. And I pre-learning breathing techniques such as this and learning about nasal breathing more than mouth breathing, regarded myself as a very fit athlete and really thought I had been pushing myself to a maximum capacity. But I realized I'd been putting myself through a maximum capacity with a limiter on, if that's sort of the best way to put it. Like I'd had a limiter on myself, and that was then unlocked, and I unlocked that when I started going nasal breathing. But the weird thing was I started reducing the intensity of what I was doing. So I think that's a part of this conversation we'll get to, which is around, you may think you're fit, but until you do these breathing methods and you actually start breathing functionally, you're probably not as fit as you think you are. So kind of leading on to that, I want to talk about your background, how you got into this, like where it all started for you. Where was the interest in breathing techniques? I know you were into Buteyko, and that's the method that you do teach. So where does that journey start for you, and what was the interest?
Yeah, I was a kid growing up with asthma. There's so many kids in the United Kingdom and Ireland. In actual fact, we have the highest incidences of asthma in the world. Australia and New Zealand are up there as well. And if you have asthma, you have breathing issues, of course. So I was predominantly a mouth breather, a faster breather, an upper chest breather. And it impacted, of course, my physical ability to do physical exercise, etc. I was on medication. I was in hospital with the condition. And nobody ever told me to breathe through my nose in all of the years that I had visited healthcare professionals. I had undiagnosed sleep apnea. And for 14 years of age, I left school altogether out of a total sense of frustration, never to return, because I was the kid that was going into school falling asleep. Now I went back to school. It's amazing how life changes. So I went back to school at 15, and I had a goal of getting into a university in Dublin called Trinity College. And I set that as my sights, and I worked hard. Now I was working 10 and 12 hours a day. Literally my entire teenage years were spent studying. And it wasn't because I was a stupid kid. My problem was that I had a sleep disorder that was undiagnosed. I was a chronic mouth breather. I was stopping breathing during sleep. I was waking up feeling exhausted. And I very much had my attention stuck in my own head. But that all goes hand in hand, because my physiology was in that sympathetic activation. I was in that stress response because of mouth breathing. Mouth breathing and chronic mouth breathing activates a stress response. Now, if you have sleep disorder breathing on top of that, you are not getting recovery. So it's almost that you have an added stress response. And of course, I'm not unique. There was a study carried out in Stratford-upon-Avon in the United Kingdom, obviously, in 2000 and the early noughties anyway. I don't know exactly the years. It was published in the Pediatrics Journal, I think, in 2012. The researcher was Karen Bonnock. She looked at 11,000 British kids and children who were snoring and having sleep issues by age 5. if these kids were untreated, they had a 40% increased risk of special education needs by age 8. Now,
Wow.
here's a study, a longitudinal study that took place over a number of years, tracking these kids over about 5 or 6 years. During the developmental period in a child's development, the brain is growing, and the brain grows during periods of deep sleep. Or in other words, deep sleep is necessary for formation of the brain. But if you have a child who has got sleep disruptions, and it's common, it's about 15% of the childhood population, and mouth breathing is a contributory factor to that. Nobody's talking about it, Lewis. Absolutely no one. And this is, the kind of the frustration. I was lucky. I found, so the story, short story, well, it's not so short, but I read a newspaper article about the importance of nose breathing, and my nose was totally stuffed up. And I used the technique to help open up my nose, and it actually worked. And it worked pretty quickly, and now I felt air hunger. There was a bit of a challenge continuously breathing through the nose, but I stuck with it. And that night I taped up my mouth, and I used a dilator on my nose, breathe right strip on my nose to help open up my nose. And the first morning, I don't notice much of a difference the first morning. The second morning I woke up, after having my mouth taped closed, it was the best night's sleep I had in 15 years. I knew I was onto something. I was practicing reducing the volume of air that I was breathing, and the temperature of my fingers increased. I always had cold hands and cold feet. And that's the thing about breathing exercises. But I have to say, there's a lot of misinformation out there about breathing. And really, it's important to think about whatever breathing exercise you are doing, and they all have benefits. It's very important to understand what is the purpose of this breathing exercise. Because you could be doing an exercise involving hyperventilation and long breath holds, and that's designed to stress the body and mind. But you don't want to be doing that all the time. You also need to bring in recovery. You need to look at your breathing during sleep, during physical exercise, and to understand breathing from a number of different dimensions, not just to focus on the biomechanics. So, the power of breathing, like I changed careers then. So I did my degree in TCD. I was there for 4 or 5 years, and I was in the corporate world. I was highly stressed in the corporate world, not because of the corporation, but because I wasn't able to cope with anything. I was this guy that was always teetering on the brink of symptoms. And you can think of any colleague who comes into you, or any person who comes in your door, and if you see them noticeably breathing faster and breathing upper chest and having irregular breathing, these people are already in fight or flight. And it doesn't take much of a situation to push them over the edge. Now, of course, it's influenced by genetics. It's influenced by learned behavior. It's more people who are prone to perfectionist tendencies are more prone to it. Female breathing, females are more prone to it as well. So, we don't necessarily have to have anxiety and panic disorder. I didn't, but I was highly strung. But the one thing I do remember, I could not concentrate. And I remember I could be reading a book, and even though I would be looking at the page, my eyes were directed towards the page, but my attention was stuck in my head. And I'd get towards the end of the page, I wouldn't know any of the content, I would have to start over again. Now, can you think that we are sending kids to school, to university, out into the working world? We are demanding that these people can concentrate, and that these kids are able to concentrate. We are not teaching them how. And I'm going to say this, and this is not, a criticism of mindfulness. Mindfulness will not address respiratory physiology. If you have an individual, and if their physiology is in that fight or flight, if you want to use mindfulness to change that, you will have to be literally up in a mountain 8 hours a day, 10 hours a day meditating. Breathing is the quick route into it. You have to get right to the source. And when people come into my door with panic disorder, we give them different breathing techniques, and I have made plenty of mistakes. I've put one guy into A&E as a result of doing breathing exercises for panic. I've had people coming in with chronic fatigue syndrome. I've completely floored them. They wouldn't come back to me. So I've made mistakes, but I've learned over the years. And I've learned as well that sometimes we have to take a nice, gentle approach. The other thing I've learned is that we can't always expect one breathing exercise to suit all. It doesn't work that way. That's the way it is.
That's a really, really interesting point. And as you're talking through the because I'm a huge advocate of mindfulness, but what you're talking about is also where I bolt on breathwork with it, is because as an athlete, let's just take athletes for example, and I use my own example of when I had one of my first debuts as a young kid. I was 21, and it was on Sky Sports. Thousands of people in the stadium, people at home watching, families in the crowd, my brother's in the crowd. Like knew I was playing that game, and I had an incredible stress response to that game. I knew I was anxious before the game. I knew I was nervous. Had seen the psychologist, asked for some advice. His advice was accept the nerves in a more psychological way. But I remember the response physically on the day, and that was that I was incredible heart rate. My breathing would have been shallow. Yeah. I was all over the place. Like eye direction was all over the place. There was no attention or focus on the task at hand, and especially to the game plan that would require a logical brain and a less emotional brain to take hold. And it was a train crash. Like, it was awful. Yeah. It was an incredibly bad response. But I look at now, when teaching things like mindfulness, it's no point even directing people to the breath without them having an understanding of how they're breathing and understanding the mechanics of it and what to feel. And even if it's just pure diaphragmatic breathing, and just understanding that to begin with. And then you can bolt on breathing in and out through the nose if it then becomes comfortable. And then adding on that mindfulness element to it, which is right now you feel calm in the physiological response to what you're doing. Now we can actually start to access how you maybe start to look at the mind, think of where the thoughts are at, and then go into that mindfulness zone. But you're totally right. You probably cannot access that. No, you can't access that if you're in a stressed response physically, because the mind responds to the body and the body responds to the mind. So it's going to be a complete cyclical impact. It's I think before we go any further, it's worth just touching on the impact of nose breathing compared to mouth breathing, why it is so much more beneficial for people than breathing through the mouth, because especially in sport, you see it through efforts that people give. They go very quickly to mouth breathing very, very early. And I get questions from people that follow me on whether it's social media or my Strava, and I'm putting up that I've done a run and it was a nasal breathing run. Why are you doing that? You are the man to answer that question as to why that is beneficial.
Thanks. Yeah, interesting your experience with your first debut. And can you imagine the number of people listening to here have had those experiences without realizing that you can change states? You know, when you're ramped up and your heartbeat is elevated and your breathing is fast and shallow, all the brain is doing is wanting to get you out of that situation. Because when you breathe fast and shallow, your brain is interpreting that the body is under threat. And the purpose of the brain is to protect the body. So the brain is literally driving you into a state to get you out of the situation. And this has helped the survival of the species throughout evolution. But if you're on a cricket field, the last thing you want to be doing is to be in that state. You need to be in a state when you're on a cricket pitch of flow. And that's a state of relaxation of the mind and that alertness there. Now, if, for example, the individual before that, we really have to pay attention to hyperventilation. And I was listening to a podcast with Dr. Rangan Chatterjee going back in May. I wrote about it in a book I was writing. And he was interviewing a brain surgeon. And you can imagine that this could be a stressful occupation. Now, I know, of course, they're trained, but you can imagine somebody lying on a table in front of you and you have their skull open and you're looking into their brains. And he said, if I get into a tricky situation, the first thing I do is prevent myself from hyperventilation. And of course, like this guy, of course he knows it, but we should all know that. It shouldn't just be reserved to the person in that situation. Because if we hyperventilate, we're in that fight or flight response. And the one way, even if we change our breathing patterns for 90 seconds and always think of the exhalation, we're always thinking that if we're hyperventilating, we have a fast exhalation. But a fast exhalation is telling the brain that the body is under threat. Don't breathe out fast if you want to relax the body. You have to breathe out slow and prolonged. And the nose is the best place because the nose is imposing a resistance to your breathing. Now, you could do pursed lip breathing. so that you're implying a resistance. But it's normal and natural to breathe in and out through the nose. And I'll answer your second question. So anytime, and I think this is the tools that we should know. And, any listener, if you do get into a tricky situation, you're in the office environment, you're feeling that your breathing is getting faster and shallow. And that's why it's very important to connect with your breath, to bring your attention out of the mind into the body. And don't think of this as left of field. It's not. I know it has been, seen as this kind of woo-woo and there's all airy-fairy around it. There's nothing like that, and really we have to take this into the people. This is really for the normal everyday person, that we can change our states. So if you're in the office or out in the football field or whatever sports you play, and if you're feeling ramped up, take a soft breath in through your nose and a really relaxed and a slow and a gentle exhalation. And when you have that relaxed and a slow and gentle exhalation, you stimulate the vagus nerve, which is wandering throughout the body. And 80 to 90% of the communication by the vagus nerve is from the body up to the brain. So when you have that slow and relaxed and gentle exhalation, the vagus nerve is stimulated. There's a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine secreted. This causes the heart rate to slow down. And when the heart rate slows down, the brain interprets that the body is safe. So anytime that we want to bring a calmness to both body and mind, we should have a slow and relaxed exhalation. And even if you do that for 90 seconds, it will help you to get you out of that stress response. Because remember, when you're in that stress response, we cannot think logically. We cannot focus because, of course, the brain wants you to get you out of there, as I mentioned about. Now, the other point that I'd like to make is 75% of the anxiety and panic disorder population have dysfunctional breathing. Is not being addressed. And when you spoke with the psychologist, and the psychologist is doing the best that they can with their training, but they should know about respiratory physiology. It's so important. It's not enough just to say to accept your nerves. If your body physiology is off, you have to be able to address that. And the psychologist in the future is going to understand the impact of breathing, and not just about breathing with the biomechanics, not just about saying, go and take a few deep breaths for yourself. Because a deep breath is often misinterpreted. And I'll give you an example. Like I was going in to do an exam back 1996, 97, a finals exam. And I was nervous going in, as we all are. But of course, if you're a mouth breather, you're going to be even ramped up altogether. And I took a walk for about 3 minutes before going into the exam hall. And during those 3 minutes, I intentionally took these full big breaths. Because I believe that, of course, this is the idea that's out there about breathing. Take this full breath, fill your lungs full of air. I did that for about 3 minutes. I walked into the exam hall. I was totally spaced out. I could not get myself together at all. I was sitting there and I can remember all over the place. Now, what I did was absolutely the wrong thing to do. And I should have literally sat down and practiced taking a very soft and slow breath in through the nose and a really, really relaxed and a slow and gentle breath out. And continue doing that to down-regulate. Or if I was overly stressed, I could have done small breath holds. Or I could do a small version of box breathing to help balance the autonomic nervous system. Or I could cup my hands. So many different things that I could do. But really the purpose is to stimulate the vagus nerve to bring the body into balance. Now, your last question, and you're probably thinking this guy is never going to stop talking. But your last question is, what does the mouth do in terms of breathing? I cannot find any function by the mouth. If I was to stand in front of a mirror, open my mouth and look into my mouth, there is no function in the mouth when it comes to the breath. All the mouth is, it's a hole, and it's a hole whereby air can go straight down your throat. Your mouth is not for breathing. Nature never designed the mouth for breathing. Only the nose is designed for breathing. And if you even look at any animal, we have a couple of dogs here, different animals around the place. They are innate nasal breathers, except a dog when it gets very hot. So what does the nose do? Well, even in your game, cricket, there was a study that was published in 2020 showing that nasal breathing improved visuospatial awareness. So you can imagine being out on the field. You have to focus on the batter, or you're focusing on where the ball is, but at the same time, you're scanning the pitch. Nasal breathing impacts that. Nose breathing improves memory and attention. That has been as well looked at in the last couple of years. we select our partners based on the communication through the nose. So all of the sensory input from the nose is going up to the brain, and the nose and the nasal airway is directly connected to the brain. Since 1988, it was known by a researcher called Swift that when individuals were continuously breathing through the nose, the pressure of oxygen in the blood increased by 10%. Nasal breathing also increases carbon dioxide in the blood, especially when you do physical exercise. That's why you feel an increased sensation of air hunger. But as carbon dioxide increases in the blood, it helps to open up the blood vessels. And it also helps hemoglobin, which is the main carrier of oxygen in the blood, to release more oxygen to the tissues. So when you breathe through your nose, you don't breathe out as much oxygen because your body is utilizing oxygen more efficiently. Nasal breathing is imperative for good sleep. Any person who's waking up with a dry mouth in the morning, you're not likely to wake up feeling refreshed. You shouldn't need to get up to go to the bathroom during the middle of the night. And when I'm working with young athletes, they'll often say that they have to do it. If you need to get up to go to the bathroom during the night, you've got disrupted sleep. And when we think about, sleep, and I think sleep is the foundation also for mental health. Any of us, we will all have every now and again a poor night's sleep. And your focus is impacted that day, your mood is impacted, and your quality of life is impacted that day. But there are some people, and they have a poor night's sleep every day of the week for months and for years. And there's no question that that is impacting mental health, but that's been overlooked. I've had people coming in with depression. I asked them, how do they wake up in the morning? And they say that they're exhausted, but nobody has asked them about their sleep quality. And here's the reason why. People who train in a specific field, they go into this little box and they often stay in it. They've done their training and they're not going outside the box. We have to start looking outside of our own field. And I'm guilty of this as well. I've spent 20 years focusing solely on the breath, and I know very little about anything else. And even in terms of the breath, what I do know is only a snippet because the application is immense. And I understand that, but it's really, really important that whoever is in, different healthcares to realize that you can't just do this yourself, that you need to be bringing in a multidisciplinary team, and you have to be looking at this. The one thing about the breath is, first, do no harm. Number two, it's very cost effective. And number three, if you give people the tools, they have it for life. And yes, they may not do the exercises as perfectly, but the first place to start is just to get up off the couch and just to do something.
Yeah.
And getting the mouth closed during sleep, but coming back to breathing through the nose. And a few more points. Your nose, you talked about diaphragmatic breathing. Well, if we breathe through the mouth, it typically activates the upper chest. So if you were to look down at your chest now and breathe through your mouth, you'll see that mouth breathing activates the upper chest. So it's shallow breathing. It's faster breathing. Mouth breathing is a fight or flight response. Nose breathing is more likely to amplitude or to harness greater amplitude of the diaphragm. And then again, nasal breathing also is harnessing the gas nasal nitric oxide. So nitric oxide is antiviral, it's antibacterial, and it helps to redistribute the blood throughout the lungs. And it also helps to open up the airways. So there's no question that nose breathing is vastly superior to mouth breathing. And for children growing up, if they have their mouth open, they are more susceptible to craniofacial abnormalities. In other words, we need a young growing child to have the mouth closed with the tongue resting on the roof of the mouth. And it's the pressures exerted by the tongue which help to ensure the forward growth of the face. Last night, I had a podcast with Mark Devine. Some people will be aware of him. I think he is SEAL fit, but he was the person, he's a former Navy SEAL, if I have my facts correct. And he made popular box breathing. Now, if you look at his facial structure, he's got a wide facial structure. He's got large nostrils. He's got really forward growth and strong development of the jaws. That's the way we should develop. But most of us, especially myself, have not developed that way. My jaws are set back. My nose is bent. My maxilla is set back. My airway is compromised. I have a deviated septum that's all over the place. One nostril smaller than the other. I would never be an athlete, So, this is the basic stuff has been overlooked. And I think now, though, the awareness is getting out there about it.
That point you just mentioned there, that the basics are being overlooked, I even take myself back to biology and physical education. And I remember there being, when I did it in A-level, there being a part on, because everything you've mentioned there about CO2, high levels of CO2, there's the Bohr effect. So we're talking about the Bohr effect, and that is a part of a textbook. It's there. Like I can almost remember it, because I remember when I did the XPT course and I read Oxygen Advantage, I'm like, I've heard this before. This is not an uncommon word to me. But I think like it was a small paragraph in it, and you now look at it and you go, that is a far larger topic than it should be. And if you extend that topic, that small topic that is in that textbook, or even take a look at it in a deeper dive, let's just say it extends from one paragraph to 2 pages, that could be enough to impact a young person for, like you said, you're learning that tool for life. And that's what I feel. I will admit, I don't get my practices perfect. I don't do them as much as I'm not regularly doing them. But what I've now got to is a nice place where I'm not, for say, putting tape on my mouth at night, because I'm confident in how I'm sleeping, because I know I'm breathing through my nose. I've had a partner that will tell me, like, you don't snore, like you're fine. And I have done that through, instead of taping my mouth, doing it running, doing nasal breathing while running, doing breath holds while walking, and impacting my breathing through those methods. And it's now become a part of, like, even if I'm sitting here, I'm aware of breathing through my upper chest. Even just by talking to you, I'm now breathing in and out my mouth, and that makes it a little bit harder because I can't breathe through my nose whilst I'm talking to you too easy. So when you're talking, I'm straight back to breathing through my nose, trying to get that almost recovery in. And I think about that, and it may sound to the listener like this is, oh my God, Lewis, like, what are you? That's a lot to be thinking about. It is at the start, but then once you've done it, it's habitual, and then you've done it. Like you're in. You've kind of learnt it, and it's become a habit. So even something as simple as the Bohr effect, giving people the understanding of, yes, it may feel uncomfortable, but this is how you should be breathing. Not it being a little subject that's just skipped over and gone, oh, by the way, like this is how CO2 and O2 exchange, and higher levels of CO2 is actually good for you. And that can be a much bigger subject to expand, especially at a younger age. And I mean, now your work and the work of others is trying to get people now where it's almost not too late, but it's a lot more harder for them to change habits at a later stage, I guess.
Well, I've had people 80 years of age coming in, so it's never too late.
Yeah.
But you know what, Lewis? I suppose the best thing to do is for people to experience it. You know, if somebody is saying, well, we're talking about breathing less air. Now, we're not talking about breathing less air all of the time. But what we are saying is, for periods of time throughout your day, gently slow down your breathing to the point that you feel air hunger. And air hunger signifies that carbon dioxide is increased in the blood. And pay attention to the saliva in your mouth and see, do you have increased watery saliva in the mouth? Pay attention to whether you can improve the circulation in your fingers if your hands are getting warmer. Pay attention to whether you get drowsy, because when you gently slow down your breathing with air hunger, it stimulates the vagus nerve. Both slow breathing and air hunger will stimulate the vagus nerve. And you will help to activate the body's relaxation response. But also, it's reducing your chemosensitivity to carbon dioxide. And what that means then is that your breathing will naturally become lighter and slower, both during rest, during sleep, and during physical exercise. So the athlete who's out there gassing out too soon, that may not be down to poor condition from a physical fitness point of view. It can be very much down to poor breathing patterns, because an athlete is training hard, but physical training will not necessarily improve your breathing, because how you breathe during your training is reflective of how you breathe for the rest of the day. And if you have an athlete who's going around, and how many athletes are going to be prone to anxiety and panic disorder and perfectionist tendencies? Female athletes then subject to hormonal changes which affect their breathing. Athletes can have asthma. And so many athletes, just as reflective of the normal population, can have dysfunctional breathing patterns, and that can hold them back. The Bolt or the breath hold test is actually a useful tool. It's not perfect. I just because people might be wondering, how can I assess my breathing? If you sit down for about 5 minutes, and then for a person just to have a timer, take a normal breath in and out through their nose and pinch their nose to stop breathing. And time it in seconds until you feel the first definite desire to breathe. And when you feel the first definite desire to breathe, or the first stress is to breathe, let go and breathe in. But your breath in, when you resume breathing, should be normal. So it's a comfortable breath hold time. You have a normal breath in and out through your nose. You pinch your nose. You start timing. How long does it take until you feel that you need to breathe? And then you let go and your breathing should be normal. A study was conducted by a professor of physical therapy in 2018, Professor Kyle Kiesel, Kiesel, and he looked at 51 individuals. The average age was 27 years of age. Only 5 of them out of the 51 had normal breathing. Now, I'm not saying that 90% or 80% of the population have dysfunctional breathing, but it's more common than we think. And his conclusion was, when he looked at their breathing from a biochemical and a biomechanical point of view and a psychophysiological point of view, you can assess functional breathing patterns using breath hold time. And if the breath hold time is above 25 seconds, there is an 89% chance that dysfunctional breathing is not present. Now, I've worked with MMA fighters. We have some premiership footballers at the moment I'm working with. We have some Olympic athletes. We're working with military. We're working with very high caliber athletes. And many of these people don't have a Bolt score of 25 seconds. I've had an MMA in the past and a Bolt score of 12 seconds. And I'm just thinking to myself, if I had a Bolt score of 12 seconds, I wouldn't be getting into a ring, because you're going to gas out. You're wasting so much energy disproportionately. And it's very important that breathing is improved. Now, you think of athletes, they have their psychologist, nutritionist, you have your strength and conditioning coach, you have a full team of people around you, but you have nobody looking at breathing. There's a wide opening here, and it should be on the curriculum in the sports science schools, because it's the youngsters coming through university who are going to be the next generation to put this out there. If you have an athlete with dysfunctional breathing, that athlete is more likely to have dysfunctional movement, because when you breathe through your nose, you have greater optimal movement of the diaphragm, and movement of the diaphragm is providing stabilization for the spine. So as we breathe in, there's a negative pressure created in the thorax as air is drawn into the lungs, but there's a positive pressure generated in the abdomen. So our posture and stabilization of the spine is determined by how well we breathe. But if you have an athlete or any individual with dysfunctional breathing patterns, they are not getting adequate functional movement and they're at a greater risk of injury. And 50% of people with lower back pain have dysfunctional breathing. Now, is it the lower back pain which has caused dysfunctional breathing, or is it the dysfunctional breathing which is fed into the lower back pain? Could be both. Mm-hmm. So but just, I suppose people don't always consider the implications that when breathing is under par, what effects it can have.
Yeah, it's an area that you're right there, that whole cyclical approach of whether it's what chicken or the egg sort of approach. Yes. But essentially, if you start at one, doesn't really matter. Like breathing just seems to me, and my experience with athletes and high performers is, it's just like you mentioned earlier, very early on in the podcast, you can take it anywhere. Like, that's the beauty of it. And there's athletes that I've been working with that have used it in stressful situations, and that's all we've done. We haven't done any sort of like mental mindset work or anything mindfulness. We've just gone to the breathing. And just by bringing that level of control to yourself, you feel in control. Because essentially the definition of anxiety is trying to control something you can't control. So when you're trying to control something like that, or you're in an anxious situation, you feel out of control by simply bringing control to your breathing, which is the first thing that you can do. It's the first point of call. It's a physiological response. And as athletes, we're physical creatures. You feel in control. Okay, I now have some level, I have a grasp on something. And then I can maybe move forward into whatever that task is with a bit more focus, less stress. There was a thing I saw recently with PJ Nestler, who is a part of XPT, PJ put up, it was a video that he was doing it, and it was the first time I'd actually heard him talk about panic attacks and being under a stressful response. And you mentioned about taking a breath in and a long exhale out. And that may be something that people may come back and say, well, great, Patrick, but my breath is all over the place. I'm in absolute terrified. I can't at that moment do anything.
Yes.
And PJ mentioned meeting the breath where it's at and then bringing it down. And he was talking about meeting people, if they are hyperventilating in that situation and their breathing is repetitive, is to go, okay, we'll take some big breaths in to start with, keep going, and then bring it down. Then go, okay, now we'll elongate those breaths to the point where you get it. So is that a good approach for someone who is under a panic response, to be able to meet themselves where they're at and then bring it down?
Yes, you could. Because if you take a full big breath, what's happening with the panic attack is that the person is feeling suffocated. And they're already in a state of hyperventilation. Now, if you were to take a couple of full big breaths, you're going to get rid of a lot of carbon dioxide, and it's carbon dioxide that's the driver to breathe. So it should alleviate the feeling of suffocation. There's a few different approaches with addressing panic disorder. And I suppose the best approach, Lewis, is to improve everyday breathing patterns. If you look at it, somebody coming in with panic disorder, if they're prone to it, not when they're having a panic attack when they're coming into you, but look at their everyday breathing. They've got a low breath hold time. They're typically breathing faster and shallow. They have irregular breathing. They are teetering on the brink of symptoms, and it doesn't take much of a situation to push them over the edge. So there's two things to address there. One is to improve their everyday breathing to develop their resilience, and to improve heart rate variability, to improve vagal tone, because HRV, for example, which is an objective measurement of vagal tone, but it gives us feedback of the functioning of the autonomic nervous system. We want to bring balance there. Now, if an individual was having panic disorder, typically I would bring them through a number of different exercises, and I often start off with small breath holds, because I can stimulate the vagus nerve that way. And I understand when somebody is in a state of hyperventilation, the last thing that they want to do is hold their breath for 3 seconds, but it's possible. It's not possible to have a slow and relaxed exhalation when you're having a panic attack. But if you're in the office and you're feeling a little bit ramped up, generally it is possible to have a slow and relaxed exhalation. But if it's not, hold your breath for 3 seconds. Another thing to do would be is to cup your hands. You know, the person is feeling they have a panic attack, cup your hands and take full big breaths. So you're taking full big breaths, but have them slow. And the whole purpose here is to pool carbon dioxide in your hands, to rebreathe the carbon dioxide back into the lungs, to increase it in the blood, to improve blood flow to the brain. And yeah, it's really about like alleviating the feeling of suffocation as no, slow and low breathing. But PJ's, it's a good tip, definitely. Yeah.
Is there, whilst we're on the subject of sort of ways in which you can do things, is there a first point of call that you, if there's an athlete, okay, I may have dysfunctional breathing, is there a sort of one of two? Is there a mechanical thing that you would prescribe to start with for beginners straight away? And then is there a exercise? Because I know Oxygen Advantage, and I really encourage everyone to buy the book, because there are practical tools in there. There are practical actual applications and exercises for people to do. But is there a single one that you might prescribe to people to just begin with to improve, whether it's their BOLT score or function of breathing?
It depends who I have in front of me.
I understand that's a question that obviously is
no, I mean it, in
broad
terms of the psyche. You know, if I have an alpha male in front of me, and if I start teaching him gentle, slow breathing, he's probably going to say this is a load of crap. So sometimes what I do is I get the alpha male to start jogging with the mouth closed. Yeah. And then I get them to do longer breath holds. Or we use a mask as well. I have a sports mask that we use to pool carbon dioxide. Sometimes when people aren't into breathing, what I do is I push them. And I really push them to the point that I'm generating a hypoxic response. And I get them into that way because they can feel that their nose is opening up. They can feel increased blood flow to the brain. So, you know, there's two aspects to what we do. One is to improve functional breathing patterns, but the other is to stress the body and mind. The alpha male may not be so interested in improving their functional breathing. So we may start off with gentle stressor exercises. And then when they start putting that into practice, then we will bring them back to functional breathing.
Okay,
so,
yeah.
But if somebody just comes in, a normal person comes in through my door, and if they were open to any practice, I would typically say, listen, we want to get nasal breathing first and foremost, especially during sleep and during physical exercise. Do everything with your mouth closed. However, if the intensity of your movement is too high, that you've lost control of your breathing in and out through the nose, if you're a recreational athlete, go slower. So slow down. Don't be breathing in and out through the nose to the point that you're pulling air in and out at such, an extreme volume, because it will cause your nasal cavity to be sore. If you're an elite athlete, do about 50% of your training in and out of your nose, and do about 50% of it in and out through your mouth. Now, we use different techniques. Like I use this is our own, like we have our own devices because I had to develop them when we were working with. So my nose is totally compromised and it's very small, and a restricted nasal airway is going to make nasal breathing during exercise more difficult. Now, if you have a decent bowl score and a decent nasal airway, you're on the pig's back. Indeed. But if you have a compromised nose and a low bowl score, you're going to find it fairly taxing. And what we do here is based on the Cottle maneuver. If you just gently prise your nostrils apart like that, you'll feel more airflow. And we use, this is a nasal dilator that we use. So then I would have people sit down and I would bring them through maybe small breath hold exercise, breathing in and out, holding the nose for 3 to 5 seconds, then breathing normally for 10, 15 seconds. Then I would have them breathe in very softly through the nose and a really relaxed and slow, gentle breath out. And the whole purpose is to generate air hunger and to help improve the bowl score. So we would practice that exercise. We practice different breathing exercises aimed at improving the biochemistry. Then we lead them on to the biomechanics. So getting greater amplitude of the diaphragm and allowing the diaphragm move back up to its resting position to increase to increase the zone of apposition to generate intra-abdominal pressure. And then we do slow breathing in maybe for people with very poor breathing in silently through the nose for 3 seconds and out for 3, especially for people who are holding their breath or who have irregular breathing patterns. So we want to train the breath cycle. Then we might increase that to breathing in for 5 seconds and out for 5, in for 5 and out for 5, to help strengthen the bar reflex to get a balance in the autonomic nervous system. We then take those tools, and I know this might sound a lot, but it's actually simple enough. I don't want to just work with somebody's breathing during rest, but then we get them doing physical exercise. How should you breathe when you go for a walk? How should you breathe when you go for a jog? How should you breathe when you go for a sprint? And then we go from there into breath holds, and that might be breathing in and out through the nose, holding the nose, and walking for 10 or 15 paces, holding the breath, then letting go. And we will do a few of those to prepare the body. And then we would do, say, a normal breath in and out, hold the nose, and start walking with the breath held, go into a jog, go into a fast jog, into a run with the breath hold. We use pulse oximetry to monitor blood oxygen saturation, and the whole goal is to drop the blood oxygen saturation and increase carbon dioxide to disturb the blood acid-base balance. And this forces the body to make adaptations to improve the buffering capacity. Now, that breath hold exercise, even though it might be just during fast jogging, is stronger than a sprint with the mouth open. And if you think of athletes who are sprinting, high intensity training with the mouth open to stimulate anaerobic glycolysis, it's traumatic for the individual if they overdo it, of course, but you could do simpler jogging exercises and have a stronger effect, but without the trauma. And then we have just different exercises. We have 26 different exercises now. We've expanded it beyond the oxygen advantage, which was written back in 2015. And just, I suppose it's having a bigger toolbox. And at the same time, I suppose you want to have that balance that you don't want to have so much information that people are totally overcrowded. But when it comes to breathing, we look at breathing from a number of different dimensions, and every breathing exercise you can put into these dimensions. Any breathing exercise that's out there, regardless of whatever discipline it's come from, what is it targeting? Is it targeting the biochemistry, which is focusing on carbon dioxide? Is it targeting the biomechanics, which is focusing on the breathing muscles and greater amplitude of the diaphragm? Is it targeting the autonomic nervous system? Is it a stressor? Is it an upregulation or is it downregulation? And ultimately, all breathing exercises, you can put them into those three different compartments. And that's why, so when people see a breathing exercise and you're asking, well, what exactly does this do? You have to ask, well, what's it affecting? The biochemistry, the biomechanics, or is it a stressor or is it a relaxer?
Yeah, just one question I did have there was around pinching the nose. So you always talk about pinching the nose on the exhale. Now,
Yes.
if you're running and you're doing that and you essentially need your arms, can you still get the same effect if you're confident enough that because some people will feel that stress response by just simply pinching their nose. They feel like someone's holding them underwater. It's that feeling of I'm really out of control. Can you still get that same physiological effect if you breathe out through the nose and feel confident enough that you can constrict the air coming in?
Yeah, same. It's the
and
same
just
thing.
shut it off. But you just do you just pinch the nose because it's a physical hold and plugging of the nose.
Yeah, I think people feel more comfortable with it. But you are right. Over the years, we would have met people who, for example, if they were at a swimming pool when they were a child and some brat of a kid come over and dunked their head under the water, the trauma that child has experienced, we see that carry through into adults. And we see that especially when they do breath hold exercises. So, yeah, I understand that. You can do it either way. You can hold your nose or you can just simply stop breathing. And just coming back to somebody, if they do have experienced trauma due to near drowning or something like that, we give them very gentle exercises to desensitize their body's reaction to it. So we use very small little breath hold exercises. And we have to do that as well with people with panic disorder because they can have an increased sensitivity towards the feeling of suffocation. If they feel suffocated, it can put them into a panic attack. So what we do is we deliberately give them a teaspoon of suffocation. And we do that to desensitize their body's reaction to it. And it works quite well. So it can be interesting.
Yeah, look, I'm very conscious of your time and I'm very grateful for your time coming on. I think the real message for people here is to genuinely, as an athlete or as an individual, to really explore your breathing, to look at it, to test it, like you said, through just simple tests like the Bolt score. But that whole concept of getting into flow, I have experienced it. I have experienced far greater experiences through whether it's me going out running now, I'm really ramping up my running, or even if it's in sport, I'm having better experiences both physiologically and psychologically because I feel more in control. I feel have this better grasp of myself, and people that I've worked with, they report the same. And it's no coincidence that all of that starts with the breath. It starts with whether it's a slow, gentle breath, whether it's using something a bit more hypoxic that's training them for endurance, for CO2 tolerance, and if anything, that flow experience, actually immersing yourself in the sport, the activity, becomes greater because you are not in a stressed situation. You are not thinking about, oh my God, I'm so out of breath. I think of people who go running and they hate running, or they hate really endurance-based activity that's essentially just exercise. And they're like, I hate it. I feel out of breath. It's just, I'm constantly fighting. And I'm like, that's not an experience you should be having. How about checking out your breathing first, and then you may enjoy that experience a lot more because you become good at it. You actually are not thinking about all of that stressful stuff. So yeah, this is something that I definitely would point people in the direction. I always ask this with guests: is there, other than obviously the Oxygen Advantage, your own books, is there a book that you recommend athletes, or even that one has perhaps changed your outlook in the sporting or athletic world?
If I was asked what was the most compelling book that I've ever read in my life, and I've probably read it 50 times, it's The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle.
Yeah.
And many people, it has been a wonderful book. I was lucky to come across it 20 years ago. And it is a book that we all need. And, other than that, like I read a lot of books, but I don't necessarily focus on one or the other. Yeah, I like, of course, James Nestor's book, Breath, is great.
I was going to say how much he backed up a lot of this. He came out
much.
and a lot of the research he went into, especially around the facial structural work, and that's again another book that has really benefited in this space, I think. And he's got some good press through it, which has been fantastic. Yeah. Another one last thing that you mentioned, I think, is well worth noting. You mentioned as a young boy that you gave mouth taping at night a go, and you didn't have a good night's sleep. That it didn't work first time, and I think that's an important point to make to people. If it doesn't work the first time, it's not that it hasn't worked; it's that it just takes a little bit of time to get there. I think that's a note worth making with stuff like that. Would you agree?
I would, Lewis, but I suppose I didn't have much breathing exercises when I read that newspaper article. So I was kind of doing it blind. Make sure that you can functionally breathe through your nose. So what I would say is during the day, spend a week breathing through your nose all the time during the day. And if your nose is stuffy, simply take a normal breath in and out through your nose, pinch your nose and just gently nod your head up and down and hold your breath until you feel a moderate air hunger. And that will help open up the nose. And just for people, we don't now tape across the lips. We have our own tape, which was designed especially with kids in mind, because of course we work a lot with dentistry, and I wanted to have a tool whereby we could train children to breathe through the nose. So we have them wear a tape during the day, but also for children who can comfortably breathe through the nose during sleep. I'll just show you the tape if it's okay. Now it's my own product, so I'm going to make a disclosure on it. But the purpose was to kind of take the scariness out of taping. So this is the orange color. We stretch it. It's elasticated and it's pulling the lips together. So it's pouting the lips. And this way we can have the mouth closed. Now there's skin color as well. Not skin color, but kind of, yes, nude color. It's a technique, or it's a tool that can be very, very useful without any side effects. By the way, that's called myo tape if people were looking for it.
So for everything that you're doing, where's the best place for people to send to find products like that, your work, your books, your courses? This is a moment to shamelessly plug everything that you have.
Our website is oxygenadvantage.com, and we have another website called buteycoclinic.com. And then we are on social media, the same names, Oxygen Advantage or Buteyco Clinic. Yeah,
all the links will be in the show notes. Look, Patrick, thank you so much for your time on here. This is not only insightful for people, but practical, which I think is really important. And that's something that not only athletes, but the everyday people need. They just want, okay, great, love the science. How can I do it? And yourself and like I've said, Oxygen Advantage gives that in spades. So thank you so much for not only coming on here, but the work that you've been doing in everything, just this space and in sport as well.
Thanks so much. Pleasure, Lewis. It's always great to chat with somebody who has the background information on breathing. It's high time it gets out there. I think it's a great tool. So yeah, pleasure. Thanks very much.